So let me just share I want to show you some images. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to take you back in time, of course, take you back over 100 years ago to the night of 4th August, 1914. Because as the Big Ben was striking 11 p.m., Britain entered the Great War. Thousands of miles away, the Indian Empire was sleeping. Night would soon turn to day, and India would wake up to the news that they too were at war. So you can see this is a poster calling for Indian men. Lord Kitchener had called for 100,000 volunteers in Britain, but he knew that they would not be enough. Britain needed the troops from the colonies, from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and of course, India. Of these, India had the largest standing army, and they would get the first call to mobilize. As you can see, these are all the posters to get people interested, people to volunteer. Indians had the largest volunteer army. And here we are. This is another propaganda poster. You can see soldiers of the king. You can see the man in the turban. And of course, there's King George V. Now, here's another one. And this is actually a pretty eerie poster as I see it, because it's in Urdu. It's to reach the local people. But the lines say that, what do you get? Sign up. You get money, you get arms, you'll get a uniform. So it's, it's all a bit weird in that sense that these are the three things they are offering for you to volunteer. But we have Lord Hardinge. He's the viceroy. He's received messages of support from the Maharajas, who have all offered their money and their troops. And the top leaders of the Congress at this time are also backing the war. And so immediately, barely hours after Britain joins the war, mobilization orders are sent out to the Indian Army. So a little about the Indian Army at this stage. After the Indian Mutiny of 1857, Indian Army was restructured. And Lord Roberts, who was the commander of the Indian Army, he showed a preference for what he called recruitment from the so-called martial races of India. And these martial races, he thought, were the Sikhs, the Gurkhas, the men from Rajasthan, and the northwest frontier. These were, of course, people who had been loyal during the mutiny. So that was a key thing. He said he had no place for the effeminate people from Madras. And of course, Bengal was not on the radar either. He had also seen the potential of Garhwalis, and he started the Garhwal Regiment in 1886. And the cantonment was built on the hill station of Lansdowne. The Garhwalis were simple men from the hills who tended their goats and owned small farms. Years of walking on the hills had made them strong. A Garhwali could walk for 10 to 15 days, carrying 20 kilos on his back. And the recruitment notes actually say that we need men with strong arms and strong legs, and that's what the Garhwalis offered. So they were actually referred to. They were men who lived in the hills. They were obviously rural peasants, and they were actually referred to in the files as the raw stock. So the raw stock have to now be cleaned up. They have to have haircuts, tidied up in that sense, uniforms, and very quickly they become members of the Garhwal Rifle Regiment. So here they are, part of the British Indian Army. Well, the Garhwal Regiment would then, I mentioned this regiment because members of this regiment, 2 members of this regiment, will go on to be awarded the coveted Victoria Cross. And their names are the Darban Singh Negi and Gabbar Singh Negi. But apart from the Garhwalis, there were the Pathans. So we have the Pathans from the northwest, and here again, I mentioned 2 Pathans, both to get further glory. One, this is Khudadat Khan, and this is Mir Dast. So now the Pathans are told that mobilization orders have happened. They have to cross this mighty Satluj River, which is flooded in August, but they make it through, and they all have to reach the ports to be transported to the Western Front. Now, apart from the Pathans, of course, we have the Sikhs. And my book is about the personal stories of people. So, which is why I'm going to talk about the personal, personalities rather than entire regiments. And this is Manta Singh, who we will talk about later, and his friend, Captain Henderson. And they set out too. He is from the 15th Sikhs, and they set out for the Western Front. And apart from the Sikhs, of course, we have the Gurkhas, loyal, brave. They come down from the hills of Nepal. They make their way to Bombay. Now, they've never seen the sea, and they bathed in the salty water. They went on route marches in the city. People of Bombay had never seen Gurkhas either. So they used to think they were Japanese. So there was this confusion. But anyway, the Gurkhas arrived in the ports of Bombay as well. Now, most of the Indians, the Hindus especially, they treated the sea as the Kala Pani, the Black Sea, and they're not supposed to cross it because crossing it would destroy their religion and their faith. But this is the first time large number of Hindu soldiers, including the Gurkhas, the Garhwalis, they are prepared to cross the Black Seas, the Kala Pani. And of course, apart from the soldiers, we have a Maharaja. This is the Maharaja of Jodhpur, of Bikaner. His name is Ganga Singh. And of course, we have the generals. So we have Sir James Wilcox. And he is born months after the Indian Mutiny, trained in Sandhurst. He's an old India hand. So very soon, the two divisions of the Indian Army, the Lahore Division and the Meerut Division, start making their way by train to the port cities of Bombay and Karachi, ready to join the British Expeditionary Force. Now, traveling with the Indian Army is not an easy task, and that's because you have Hindus, Muslims, you have so many religions. Sorry. Okay. The Hindus would not drink water given by the Muslims. The Muslims would not eat pork. The Hindus would not eat beef. The animals had to be slaughtered separately. So along with the soldiers, they marched an army of followers, the cooks, the cleaners, the sizes, the grooms, the bellow blowers, the kneaders of dough. So here you can see the cooks. They're going to be cooking literally within meters of the front line. Now at this time, the Indians are on these ships, but they don't actually know where they're going. They haven't been told their final destination. And it's only on the ship's wireless that they hear that they are going to the Western Front. And there are cheers. They're very excited. They spend their time on board, doing their drills, getting some exercise. Muslims go on the deck and pray towards Mecca. The soldiers ride home. And as they hear that they're going to the Western Front, the cheers ring out because this is the first time that they're going to be marching shoulder to shoulder with their British colleagues. So it's a very special moment for them. And here they are. On 26 September, the Indian ships arrive in Marseille. They are the first of the colonial troops to arrive. And as they disembark, they're greeted with cheers of Les Hindus by the French. It's the first time the French had seen these exotic soldiers of the East. And as the Sikhs march down France, the French ladies come out to greet them. They want to give them flowers, and much to the embarrassment of the Sikh soldiers, they want to give them a kiss as well. So as they march down the camps, the cheers continue. The Indians have learned a few words of English, and they reply with the only thing they know, and they say, hip, hip, hurrah. So they march to their camps at this stage, and we can see that it's the cold autumn months, but most of them are still in just their cotton khaki drill. They have not yet been supplied warm clothes. And this particular photograph is of the followers. You can see they look pretty bedraggled here, still in their cotton khakis, desperate to keep themselves warm. In the camps, they actually wrap themselves up in tablecloths, anything they can find, eiderdowns. And the French watch in fascination as these men from the East settle down in these camps. They're making their chapatis and rotis, they're washing their clothes, the Sikhs are tying their long hair, the barbers giving them a shave. And you can see the Frenchmen just sort of standing around and watching them in complete awe. And of course, there's facilities, separate facilities have to be set up for the Hindus and Muslims, so they are slotted differently. The English side, they want to make absolutely sure that nothing goes wrong. They have memories of the mutiny where, the soldiers mutinied because they feared there was pork fat on the cartridges. So here they want to make absolutely sure that nothing goes wrong. And of course, suddenly the French countryside is transformed with the Indians. They like to eat goat meat, but of course they had to, mainly eat sheep. But they tried their best to get them goat. So here's a young boy carrying across a sheep, and he's heading for the Indian camp. People gathered at the railway stations just to see the Indians. They would give them biscuits and cakes and cheer them on. And they watched them along the train tracks, just doing the things that they do, which is, washing themselves. I mean, this could be a scene from rural India, but it's actually happening in France. They watch them as they go about their ways. And at the camps and the billets where they go to, the Indians, they make, they follow their religious practices. The Sikhs set up this little gurdwara in a barn, and you can see them here singing their songs. They also, quickly make friends with the locals. Again, you can see a soldier playing with a local French boy. And, they even have time for a little bit of wine. But actually, many of these, you must note, are actually propaganda postcards. I think the man on the right has never held up a glass of wine, but here he is. He looks equally puzzled. This lady looks very happy, but here they are. So they were also given, part of this just to show the camaraderie and that, the Indians were settling in very well. So these were propaganda postcards. And of course, soon it's time to travel to the front line. They are transported in these red London buses which come out to take them. And here they are. You can see all the Indians and the others, French and English, along with them. Before long, they arrive in Belgium. Here's the first of the Gurkha battalions coming in. They reach Flanders. They soon take up their positions in the trenches, still in their cotton drill. So you can see them here lining up in Ypres in Belgium. They are thrown into the deep end. With no time to get accustomed to the trenches, they find themselves in the First Battle of Ypres, defending the British line. There's not enough barbed wire, not enough ammunition, and not enough troops. Even the trenches were shallow and soon filled up with water and mud. All the while, the German bombs rained down on them. The Indians had never seen warfare like this. They were used to hand-to-hand combat, a clash of steel and swords. Yet they held on. On a cold, damp day in October, when the men from the regiment were killed, Sipai Khudadat Khan kept firing till the last bullet was over and held his trench till reinforcements arrived. He became the first Indian to win the Victoria Cross. The action of the Indians allowed the British to hold the line, and the Germans could not reach the ports of Belgium. Meanwhile, in France, the Garhwalis and the Sikhs were in action in Neufchâtel and Festubert. Here you can see the men in the trenches, and you can see the Garhwalis on the road. And Darwan Singh Negi of the Garhwal Regiment won the second Victoria Cross for the Indians in Festubert. In December 1914, the man from the hills of Garhwal was personally presented the medal by King George V in Laucon in France. When asked if he had any wish, he said that he wanted a school to be built in the villages in Garhwal so the people could be educated. The school is still standing today. By November, the Indians had their first sight of snow. Still without greatcoats, they braved their first winter in the cold, muddy trenches. They wrote home, and they were mainly letters of desperation. In the trench, the snow rises from the feet to the neck, and the feet and hands are frostbitten. It rains and snows day and night, wrote a soldier. Another lamented, the whole world is being sacrificed, and there is no cession. It is not a war, but a Mahabharat. After a brief respite over Christmas, a fresh offensive was planned in the new year. The Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March would be the first battle where the Indian Corps worked as a complete unit. This is Neuve-Chapelle in France. It was also the first time that the Indians broke through the German defenses, but the casualties were enormous. In just 3 days of fighting, 4,233 Indians lay dead. Gabbar Singh Negi of the Garhwal regiment would fight to the last and die on the battlefield. He would posthumously be awarded the Victoria Cross. In his village in the hills of Garhwal, his 14-year-old bride, Saturi, would spend her life alone, wearing the Victoria Cross pinned on her sari. It was all she had to remind her of her husband. She would take the salute at the memorial in Garhwal, built for him, till her death in 1981. There was to be yet another poignant story of sacrifice at Neuve-Chapelle. And this is the story of Manta Singh. Manta Singh of the 15th Ludhiana Sikhs was in the field when he saw his captain, George Henderson, being injured. And he, thinking nothing of the shelling and the firing, he took a wheelbarrow, put his captain on it, and wheeled him back to safety in the trenches. But as he was doing this, Manta Singh himself took a bullet on his leg. And so he was severely injured. Manta Singh was taken to Brighton, but he didn't survive. He lost his life, but Henderson survived. And Henderson would never forget his friend Manta Singh's sacrifice. So the story doesn't really end there. When Henderson returned to India after the war, he ensured that Manta Singh's son, Asa Singh, joined the regiment. Now, Asa Singh fought in the Second World War with George Henderson's son, Robert. Their descendants, Ian Henderson and Jaimal Johal, now live in Britain and are firm friends. So it was a sacrifice in the battlefield that forged this friendship between 3 generations of families. As the war drew on without end, the soldiers wrote letters home about the horrors of war. No one who has ever seen the war will forget it to their last day, wrote a Pathan soldier. Just like a turnip is cut into pieces, so a man is blown to bits by the explosion of a shell. All those who came with me have ceased to exist. In April 1914, the Indians faced the German gas attack in Ypres, tying their turbans over their faces to protect themselves. For his bravery in the gas attack at the Second Battle of Ypres, Mir Dast was awarded the Victoria Cross. Here is Mir Dast. He was so badly injured, he was also taken to a hospital in Britain. He was presented the medal in the grounds of the Brighton Pavilion by King George V. He was badly injured, but he wanted to stand up to accept his medal. Now, as the number of wounded Indians arrived in England increased, the Brighton Pavilion was converted into a hospital for Indian soldiers. The soldiers lay under the grand chandeliers of the former palace and relaxed in the grounds. One soldier remarked that he was in heaven. It was a far cry from the trenches, but of course, they knew that as soon as they were healed, they would be sent back to the trenches. Well, the king and queen came to visit the soldiers at the pavilion, and soon it became a very useful publicity tool. Images of King George talking to soldiers, presenting the VC to Mir Dast, they were turned into postcards and sold in the thousands. And they were used to recruit more British troops and, of course, more Indian troops. Now, 20,000 copies of the brochure in Brighton showed the Indian soldiers in the grand music room or in the banquet hall, and these were sent to India. Well, of course, they weren't going to go there to lie in these grand palaces. They were going to go there to fight in the trenches. But here we are. These are pictures that were sent back. This is the dome in Brighton, and this too was converted into a hospital. However, English nurses were not allowed to nurse the patients, nor could English ladies visit them. The English did not want any liaison between lonely English ladies and Indian soldiers, so they were going to be kept far away from each other. The Kitchener Hospital was the largest hospital in Brighton. It was surrounded by high walls and barbed wire fences. The Indians were taken for supervised walks, which led to a lot of protests and even a shootout at the hospital. One soldier referred to it as the Kitchener jail. Children as young as 10 were taken to the front line. They went as bellow blowers and kneaders of dough, and some of them got injured and ended up in hospital. So here's a picture of young Pim. Here he is, and here lying in bed. Pim was just 16. He had his arm and his leg blown off by German shell fire. When the Queen visited Brighton, she went to his bed and she presented him a rose. And of course, here he is holding up that rose. The British wanted to ensure that the Indians were happy and cared for in the hospitals. They did not want any mutinies. So great care was taken to see that all the religious practices of the soldiers were carried out, and there were separate slaughterhouses for both the Hindus and the Muslims. So in Brighton, we probably see the first halal shop being set up. As you can see, it's a Mohammedan meat house, and next to it is the Hindu meat house. So they made sure that the slaughter was done in the way that the religions wanted. The soldiers who were good enough to travel were also taken on outings in open-top cars so that they would be visible to the people who could wave to them, see them in these turbans and cheer them on. So it was all a bit of propaganda. But of course, they are happy. You can see them smiling on this trip. But despite all the arrangements, the bright lights of Brighton, the hospital care, the soldiers were depressed. A Gurkha soldier committed suicide at the Kitchener Hospital. In letter after letter, the soldiers spoke of their longing to go home and their despair that they would be sent back to the trenches. A soldier wrote, "For God's sake, don't come. Don't come to this war in Europe. Tell my brother, for God's sake, not to enlist." There was despair that only those who had lost an arm and a leg had any hope of returning home. Now, most of the soldiers were illiterate, so they had to dictate their letters. As you can see, he is dictating this letter. Sorry. By the end of 1915, most of the infantry was sent to Mesopotamia, Palestine, and North Africa. They would have to suffer now the harsh desert conditions. The cavalry, sappers, and miners remained behind in Europe. They watched their British counterparts go home on leave, but they themselves could not go on leave because the sea journey was too long and they could not spare any ships for them. So many of them actually stayed on the whole duration of the war for 4 years or 5 years without a break. And the Indians played their role in the infamous Battle of Somme, which began on 1st July 1916. On the first day of the battle, they were photographed doffing their hats. In the first few hours alone, the British lost 20,000 men and 40,000 were seriously injured. Never had such a beautiful summer day seen so many dead. By mid-November, the Battle of Somme was over. The British suffered around 420,000 casualties. The total number of dead on both sides was 1.3 million. But while the Indian infantry were fighting in the trenches, the first Indian pilots were taking on the Germans in the air. So these are 2 Indian pilots. This is Hardeep Singh Malik and this is Indralal Roy. Hardeep Singh Malik became the first Indian pilot to join the Royal Flying Corps. The dapper Sikh, who had graduated from Oxford, had to fight against British prejudice to be enrolled as an officer in the Air Force. Malik opened the doors. Following him into service was 18-year-old Indralal Roy, also known as Laddie Roy, a bright young Bengali who was barely out of school. Like Malik before him, Laddie was full of youthful verve and energy. His only ambition was to down as many German planes as he could. He also enjoyed sketching. Between 9th July and 19th July, in just 10 days, Laddie took down 9 German aircraft, becoming India's first flying ace. It was all too soon to end for Laddie. While flying a dangerous mission in France on 22nd July, his plane was attacked by 4 German planes and a dogfight followed. His plane was shot. Not to be cornered, the teenager fought back, taking down 2 enemy planes with him. Laddie was only 19. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and became the first Indian to receive this award. Less than 3 months after Laddie died on the skies over France, the war was over. Over 73,000 Indians died in the war. Hundreds of thousands were seriously wounded and returned to India, their lives damaged forever. To acknowledge the contribution of the Indians in the war, they were allowed to attend the Imperial War Cabinet in London and then the peace talks in Paris in 1919. So here you can see the representatives from India. This is Lord Sinha, and here we have the Maharaja of Bikaner, Ganga Singh. The Maharaja of Bikaner represented princely states of India. Lord Sinha represented the constituent assemblies. India had secured its place at the high table, and the Maharaja of Bikaner signed on the Treaty of Versailles. The signing in the Hall of Mirrors was immortalized in this painting by William Orpen. It shows the Maharaja standing proudly wearing his turban. India had backed the British in the war effort, hoping to get Dominion status as a reward. However, they received no such prize. Barely 5 months after the war, General Reginald Dyer fired on an unarmed crowd made up largely of Sikh men, women, and children who had gathered at a park near the Golden Temple in Amritsar on 13th April 1919. The peace talks in Paris were actually still on at this time. Despite the loyalty of the Sikh troops and their contribution to the war, Dyer ordered his men to continue firing till the last bullet was over. It was an act that alienated the nation. The poet Rabindranath Tagore returned his knighthood in protest, and the Indian struggle for independence moved up a gear. Meanwhile, as political unrest and economic crisis overtook India, the soldiers of World War I were gradually forgotten. The new Indian heroes were the ones who were fighting and dying for independence. Over the years, the soldiers were forgotten, both by the masters they fought for and by their own countrymen. Only a few villages in India and Pakistan remembered their heroes. In the small hill station of Lansdowne, the image of Darwan Singh Negi and Gabbar Singh Negi can be seen on the road. The station is proud of its VC recipients. In the remote village in Pakistan that was the home of Khudadat Khan, there are road signs pointing to his house. The name of the Indian dead and missing are recorded in memorials in France and Flanders. This is the Indian memorial at Neuve-Chapelle. Their names are mentioned along with other Commonwealth soldiers in the Bedford House Cemetery in Ypres, in Belgium. The names of the Indians are carved on pillars on the Menin Gate in Ypres. There is a service held here every night, and it is these front pillars that have the names of the Indians. So here we can see their names up in close. So we have Lance Naik Khan Bahadur, Havildar Mahan Singh, Naik Laturia, Sipai Abdullah Khan. There are 2 whole columns covered with the names of these men who were just lost. Their bodies were never found. Those who died in England are remembered. The Muslim soldiers were buried at the Brookwood Military Cemetery. They are buried there. The Hindus were cremated at the South Downs in Patcham near Brighton. An Indian-style chhatri was built there after the war, and an annual memorial service is held there every summer. Now, apart from the soldiers, there's also a very interesting story about the follower, and his name was Sukha. He too had his gravestone. Now, Sukha was an untouchable from India. I say untouchable in quotes. He was from the low castes, And when he died, he fell ill. He died in January 1915. He was in the hospitals. He was sweeping the hospitals. He was cleaning the ships. And when he died in this hospital in England, his case went into the hospital files because they took his body to they said, will the Hindus cremate him on Patcham Downs? And the Hindus said no, because Sukha was an untouchable. So they took him to Woking Mosque and said, will the Muslims bury him? And the Imam of Woking Mosque said, no, Sukha is not a Muslim. So Sukha, there was nobody to bury Sukha. He was lying, on no man's land until the vicar of the local church in Brockenhurst, he said that he would bury Sukha because Sukha had died for them. So in this very beautiful church is Sukha's grave. And people now go, quite far to go and see it. You can see this grave is quite sort of stained with moss. It's now been cleaned up. And there are flowers every time for him. There were other followers too. And they're just known by their first names. They were cooks. You can see follower Babu, follower Hansa. Were they cooks? Were they transport workers? Were they cleaners? So, they lie here, thousands of miles away from their houses as well. Few visit these graves as they are far away from their homes in India. At the Indian Memorial at Neuf-Chapelle, where the names of over 4,000 Indians are carved, there was no one the day I visited. Only the songbirds bore witness to the dead. A single wreath lay there with the words, "Our shared future is built on our shared past." So over 100 years after the Great War, I hope I've been able to revive a few of the stories, a few of the personal stories of the soldiers who went to war and crossed the Kala Pani and, gave their lives for king and another country. So thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. Sometimes we think about wars and large scale loss of life in a very impersonal way, and I think it's a way to protect ourselves. But when you put a name to the person and when you put a face to the person, I think the stories become so much more up close, and there are thousands of stories that need to be told, and thank you for telling them.
You're welcome.
Pulling them out. There are a few questions. Farouk asks whether there are any first personal accounts of any Indians who have participated in World War One. He says that there was a translation from Gujarati recently, the first World War adventures of Nariman Karkaria. And do you have any opinion on the text of that?
Right. I don't personally know that text, but so my reports of the first hand were from the letters. So there are thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of letters written by the soldiers, which were sent back to India. And the reason we have them here, they're all kept in the British Library, and I spent days and days going through all of them, is because they were censored. So the censor office would check every letter. They were translated, they were censored, and we can see how they were sent, including those letters that didn't make it. If the letters that were saying things like "don't come here," which I read out, or letters saying things are bad, those letters were not sent, so they were withheld. So that is the first-hand account from many of just the ordinary soldiers. These soldiers are all illiterate. So let's not forget the background. They were peasants, they were illiterate. Most of them couldn't write these letters. They had to dictate them. And so there's very little, unlike what we have from England, where all the soldiers, obviously, even the Tommies, they wrote. We have the poets, we have the letters, we have so much archive material because, they all wrote back. We don't have that much from India except for these letters. So in a way, I'm glad they were censored because that's the only reason we have them. Otherwise, they would have all been lost. But obviously, they were censored for the wrong reasons.
So, are the photographs also from the same archive? Because there's some wonderful pictures that you've put up. I mean, in a sense, momentous of
Mhm,
those wars. So they're
mhm.
also from the archive, is it?
Yeah, so many of them are from the British Library, some are personal collections, some are from Brighton. So it's some from the Imperial War Museum. It's a variety of sources, and I've named the sources in my book. And yep, so here's the book for those who are interested. It's called For King and Another Country, just as the title. And well, all the details, many more details are in the book itself. So
I hope that
many
all
more
those
stories.
I hope that all those who are interested will pick up a copy of your book. We
Mhm,
recently had another speaker, Malvika, who talked about collecting oral stories from
mhm,
people, from the time of independence. So I guess that would be the other side of families who've
mhm,
lost people. Of course, we would not have any immediate relatives of people who went into the First World War, but at least their descendants to tell some of the stories from the
mhm.
inside.
Yeah, well, for mine, I went to Garhwal. I went to this village in Garhwal. I followed this trail of both Darwan Singh Negi and Gabbar Singh Negi and spoke to the families. So the photo of Saturi Devi is from the family, with standing with her medal. The accounts of Saturi Devi are from the family. For Darwan Singh Negi, his son was still alive. I met him in Lucknow, so he had so much to say. And it was amazing. I saw, he had the medal. He brought it for me. I saw the Victoria Cross. So, yes, oral stories. These are again oral records. He told me the story about how the king asked him, what do you want? Because the king would always ask for, what would you like? And it just shows the selflessness. I mean, he didn't want money. He didn't want titles and honors. All he wanted was a school, and that school is still surviving in Garhwal, in the hills in Garhwal. So these stories are not in the records. These are oral histories, and these I got from the families by going to the villages.
Wonderful. Commander Mohan Narayan says that the Indian troops had fought for the British both in the Persian Gulf and the two Opium Wars in China. So he just says in the mid 19th century. So he says it's probably not the first time that the Indian troops crossed the seas in the Great War.
Well, the Western Front, this is the first time they're going that far. So it is their first battle in the
On the
West.
Western
So
Front.
France and Flanders, definitely. Yeah.
Right. So there's a question from Nicola, and I think that's a question that everyone has every time we hear, because there is such evident disparity between the soldiers from Britain and the soldiers from India. Earlier speakers have also mentioned how the hierarchy sort of, where the British soldiers' hierarchy ended is where the Indian soldier hierarchy would start. So they could never be equals. So
Mhm.
were they well compensated?
Mhm. So their pensions were less, and this, I mean, the Gurkhas were agitating till now. I mean, till very recently, I'll say, because their pensions for those veterans were actually still half of what a British soldier would get, because they would think you're going back to Nepal and your cost of, living is less, whatever, but they should still be getting the same money. So the Gurkhas now are still agitating. And this is not nothing to do with the First World War, Second World. These are still, so there is still a discrepancy going on. But of course, their pensions were very meager. When they were recruited, it was for 11 rupees a uniform and a pair of boots and 3 meals a day. That is what they got. And they only hoped that they, if they got honors, they would get something more. But as we saw with Darwan Singh Negi, he didn't want money, he wanted a school. He got the highest honor, the Victoria Cross. So they were not mercenaries. But yes, no, there was definitely discrepancy in the way they were treated. Also, in the First World War, we have them only as soldiers. There are no officers apart from those who are doctors and others, because it's all entirely, they have these viceroy commissioned officers, but not Sandhurst trained. And this discrepancy is something they deal with for the Second World War. They start training Indians. There are pilots who are now taken out. Sandhurst trains generals, and they go on to fight in the Second World War as officers. So there's a big difference between the First World War and the Second World War in how the British now start treating the Indian soldiers. And of course, they're not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing this for very strategic reasons, that, you've got to have officers. Um, Otherwise, it's not going to work. You cannot keep them just as mere sepoys.
I guess the first time they were afraid because they didn't want them to learn or so we hear. They did not want them to learn the tactical side of military planning, lest the Indians use it right back at them.
Exactly. I mean, they were still scarred from the mutiny. So there was extra caution. They were not even given arms. I mean, they were literally given these guns and everything very close to the, when they finally reach the front line.
Taranjot has a personal question. It says, do you have any data on the 87th Punjabis in the World War One? Because his grand uncle was a part of that regiment.
Right. I'm sorry, I don't, because there were just so many regiments. It's not possible to cover them all. I chose a few to tell my story, and I've sort of highlighted some pilots, two pilots who I talk about, who I mentioned, Hardeep Singh, because very few people knew that we had Indian pilots flying in the First World War. It's something that even I discovered as I was researching. So I mentioned two of the pilots, and I've taken the story of, I had to pick a few people whose stories I follow.
Actually, to be honest, I've also heard today for the first time that there were Indian pilots in World War One. So
yeah, there were four Indian pilots, and the first Indian pilot was actually a Parsi, but he didn't actually fly. So he joined the Royal Air Force, but he didn't fly. So the others then followed him, and they were actually in combat.
Adil would like to know, as I think a question that I had, were there Indian women as well who were participating in the wars? Especially because you said that there were no nurses, or no British nurses who were allowed access into the hospital. So who was tending them? Were there any Indian nurses there?
That's really interesting about the Indian nurses. So no, we don't really know about the Indian nurses, but we had volunteers. So they would go. They needed orderlies, they needed cooks, so they would go to the local Indian community to get them. And they said, you can treat the soldiers. So the orderlies were trained, and those medical students were there who would come and help with the injured Indian soldiers. But we had Princess Sophia Dilip Singh, who is the granddaughter of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. She volunteered as a nurse. So she was we've seen her in her uniform and everything. She volunteered as a nurse. She went to visit the soldiers and help them. And again, we also know this because they wrote that, we were visited by the princess. They wrote back in their letters. She is there's this high regard, especially the Sikh soldiers who got really excited when she came. And they said she's the granddaughter of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, came to look after us. So they were very excited. So probably I would say one known person was only her who was there nursing voluntarily. Apart from that, not a lot, not any person whose name I have been able to identify.
I think I'm sure everyone was moved with the story of Sukha. Because here was a guy who went to fight across the oceans, and yet had no claimant. And I'm glad that the local vicar found it worthy of him to be buried there. So that's a very moving story, and I think Nikolai echoes my sentiments there.
Sukha's story has gone around the world, so I feel very happy because Sukha is a person who is faceless. I don't have an image for Sukha. All I have is his life story carved on that memorial stone and a few records from the hospitals, and the Commonwealth War graves. So yeah, it was a very moving story that had to be told.
Mande Mohan Narayan wants to know whether the troops were from the princely kingdoms, and were the troops from the princely kingdoms and the regular Indian army troops mixed and deployed together, or were they separately deployed?
No, they were separate. So mainly the imperial troops had their own troops, and they were actually more active in the in Egypt, North Africa, Palestine, Mesopotamia. So those campaigns. So we had Ganga Singh actually himself, the Maharaja of Bikaner, whose photo I showed. He actually led a camel charge himself in Egypt. So the imperial troops were small in number, but they were mainly attached to their own Maharajas and their own companies.
So, what was the motivation of the Maharajas to lead their troops into war on account of British?
Well, the Maharaja was a flamboyant man. It was this, swashbuckling bravery. He had to do his bit. He was just going up and down saying, I need to go. His letters, well, the details are in the book. As soon as war breaks out, he is writing to the viceroy, I need to, I want to go there. I want to be there. So it's all this heroism, really, that wants. And he was also a friend because the royalty were all friends. So he was a friend of King George as well. So, that works, which is how he lands up signing the Treaty of Versailles. Because there is a question as to who should sign it. Should Lord Sinha represent India or should the Maharaja? And of course, the king decides, oh, it's got to be the Maharaja. So it is the Maharaja. It's as arbitrary as that. So he signs, but he did lead a camel charge, and he did, yeah, he did his role. There was also Sir Pratap Singh, who was quite elderly at this time because he was known. I mean, he was around when Queen Victoria was around, and he was there. He reaches the front line, and he is raring to go. And there's all these reports saying he just wants to get his gun and reach the front line, but please keep him away from the front line. So they didn't want Maharajas, getting shot. They kept them away from the main front line.
It's also, suddenly you see that the Jeep said that they were fighting for the motherland, and that's the moment you realize that the motherland that they're fighting for is really not their own country, but the motherland. And I guess,
yeah. Well, that's why the title of my book is for another for King and Another Country.
that was the connection. Yashwanti says that thank you for an interesting and informative session, and I will pick up your book, as does Revati say that this discussion is really interesting. Nishan would like to know that many people might have been taken prisoners of war. So, what happened to them? Were they returned, or what happened to those people?
They were returned. So we do know that they went back. They all limped back. They those who remember, they were peasants, so they worked on the soil. If they lost their arm or their leg, they couldn't go back to farming. And that's why when Manta Singh, who dies, who took a bullet in his leg, when they said we have to amputate it, he says, no, don't, because what use is a farmer without, his legs? What will I do? Better that I die. He does eventually die, even though they amputate his leg. But yeah, I mean, they limp back. And it's not just the injuries that they go back with, it's also the mental scars. So while back in Britain, they slowly, what was then known as shell shock, and so many suffered from it. They were sent to hospitals in Britain for shell shock. Slowly they realized that they needed psychiatrists to deal with them, and there were mental hospitals that were taking them in India. There really was nothing for them. There was no support. So those with serious mental health issues were just left on their own. And of course, the most deadly thing that came back with the troops is actually two soldiers who carried back the Spanish flu. And that, we know, devastated Bombay, especially. Bombay was the hardest hit. Millions died in India because of the Spanish flu, and it came with the soldiers, came back on the ship in 1919. So that was another thing that came.
Vanda Mohan Narayan wants to know whether there was any special reason for selecting Brighton as the place to hospitalize the Indian soldiers.
So Brighton is on the coast, and the ships would come in from the ports of France. So they would come from Calais to Southampton, and then it was a short train ride to the coast to Brighton. And of course, Brighton had this beautiful Brighton Pavilion and the dome, and they thought it would be quite, and because it has an Indian theme. The Brighton Pavilion has these domes and a sort of Indian theme going. They thought the Indians would feel very at home if they put them up there. And this myth was spread around. It actually belonged to the council. It had been sold by Queen Victoria ages ago. It wasn't a royal residence. And it had been bought by Brighton Council. But the soldiers were told the king has given you his house to live in. And this sort of myth, they allowed it to spread so that, the soldiers would feel they're being very special. The king has given us his house. He's coming to see us. And, look how well looked after we are.
Wow. Lovely. Okay, so if there are no more questions, I
Mhm,
think that we can say bye bye on this Saturday evening. Thank
mhm.
you so much. I loved hearing some of these personal stories, and I'm sure so did everyone else. I hope to be able to pick up a copy of your book and have a look at it and
Mhm,
sort of get a better sense about some of the people that you've tracked down.
mhm.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to everyone who's joined us this Saturday evening. And we look forward to seeing you over the next 3 weeks and taking you to different cities of India with the speakers from different parts of the country. So thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye bye.